You know that feeling when something doesn't feel right, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's how it started, years ago, with my land. Nestled on the outskirts of town, my property was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise, the politics, the endless bureaucracy. A dammed river ran through it, a silent companion glimmering in the sun. I had plans for the land, trails, cabins, maybe a small farm. But life had other plans, or so I thought. One morning, I drove up the gravel road that led to my property, expecting the usual silence. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, water trickling against the dam. But that day, something was off. There were trucks, lots of trucks, bulldozers, dump trucks, and most unnervingly, signs. Future homes, approved by HOA. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was dreaming. No, I wasn't. 35 homes. They had plowed through acres of trees, filled the creek with sediment, and were laying foundations as if I had signed away my life's work. The HOA had done it, without warning, without asking, without permission. I walked closer, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew these people. They were your typical HOA types. Neat lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of entitlement that made the blood boil. They smiled when they waved, but behind the masks were sharks. And apparently, they thought I was just another obstacle to bulldoze. I stopped in the middle of the dirt road, watching as one of the supervisors waved me away. "Private property," I said, but my voice was swallowed by the machines. One of them smirked. "Not anymore. HOA approved it. You're trespassing." Trespassing? On my own land? My stomach churned. Anger, shock, disbelief, and deep down, a little thrill, because they had no idea I had a secret they couldn't touch. A dam, old but functional, that controlled the flow of the river that ran right through their new dream homes. I walked to the edge of the water, running my hand over the rusted metal gates. Years of maintenance, of quietly managing the water, of knowing every inch of this land. It all suddenly felt like ammunition. And that's when I smiled. I stood there for a long moment, just watching. The hum of machinery was deafening, but to me, it sounded like opportunity. I had to be careful, though. These people thrived on intimidation. They thought they could steamroll anyone who questioned them. But they had no idea how patient I could be, or how much I understood about the land they were desecrating. The supervisor, a man named Garrett, strutted over, clipboard in hand. "Sir, you really shouldn't be here. You could get hurt, or worse, arrested for trespassing." I tilted my head. "Arrested? On my own land?" He chuckled like I'd just told a bad joke. "The HOA has all the paperwork. You don't. You're out of your depth here." Out of my depth? That was a laugh. I'd spent years studying this property. Every soil sample, every bend in the creek, every sluice and valve in the dam. I knew it better than anyone. And if these so-called homeowners thought they could plop their houses here without consequences, they were about to learn the hard way. As they worked, I wandered along the edge of the river, inspecting the dam. It was old, yes, but still strong. Built decades ago by my grandfather, it had withstood floods, storms, and the occasional reckless neighbor. And now, it was about to do something it had never done before. I caught the eye of one of the new neighbors, a woman perched on the porch of a half-built house. She waved politely, smiling like she had no idea what she'd just walked into. It was infuriating. They were blind, thinking this was all perfectly legal, thinking that HOA approval made it theirs. I retreated to the small control room by the dam. It was dusty, the kind of place you only visit when you absolutely have to. There were levers, valves, and a few warning lights that flickered ominously. Every time I pulled one of those levers, I felt the power of the water beneath my feet, and a small thrill ran through me. The water obeyed me. It could protect me, or it could teach the HOA a lesson they'd never forget. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed them to get comfortable, to think that nothing would stop them. That way, the eventual shock would be absolute. Over the next few days, I became a phantom observer. I drove past at dawn, watching construction crews pour concrete. I circled the perimeter, taking mental notes of weak points, low-lying areas, and houses closest to the river. I even took pictures, just in case. Not that I needed evidence for anyone. This was personal. Then came the first confrontation. Garrett approached me with a group of workers behind him, all trying to look intimidating. "Listen," he said. "You need to leave. You're making people uncomfortable." I leaned on the railing of the dam, letting my gaze drift lazily over the houses. "You're making me uncomfortable," I replied. "On my land. You built 35 houses where none were supposed to be. Tell me, Garrett, do you even know who owns this land?" He stiffened. "The HOA has legal approval." "You, legal approval?" I cut him off, voice calm but sharp. "From whom? Did someone check the actual property records? Did someone ask me?" He opened his mouth to argue, then paused. His workers shifted uneasily behind him. I could see the cracks forming in their confidence. The arrogance that had carried them this far was starting to falter. I smiled, a small, patient smile. "You think 35 houses can ignore the river that runs through this land? You think 35 homes are immune to a little water?" He didn't respond, and for once, silence fell. It was the silence of realization, the moment when people start to understand that they've overstepped. That night, I sat in my cabin near the dam, staring at the water. The current whispered promises of revenge, not out of malice, but justice. They had taken what was mine. Now, the land had its own voice, and it spoke through the river. I traced my hand along the old metal lever. Soon, they would see just how much power a river could wield when someone truly cared for it. And when they did, it wouldn't be messy. It wouldn't be loud. It would be unforgettable. Days passed, and the construction crews were relentless. The roar of machines had become the soundtrack of my life, a constant reminder of the invasion. Every time I drove past, I saw more walls rising, roofs taking shape, and the HOA's smug little signs of ownership dotting the horizon. They thought they had won. They thought the land had surrendered. But the river doesn't forget, and neither do I. I watched them carefully, mapping their routines. The supervisors held morning briefings, workers clocked in and out like clockwork, and the new homeowners strutted around, proud of their new view, blissfully unaware that the water lapped at their foundations with growing impatience. Every day, I calculated the flow, the pressure, the weak spots in their drainage. I made notes in a tattered notebook, the kind of notebook that would one day become the blueprint for their reckoning. Garrett, of course, continued to provoke me. He'd appear out of nowhere, clipboard in hand, trying to intimidate me with hollow warnings. "Sir, if you interfere with the construction," he started, but I cut him off. "I'm interfering?" I said with mock surprise. "All I've done is look at my own land," he glared. "We have HOA approval." "You're trespassing," I repeated. Funny. Somehow I feel like the real trespassers are the ones building houses where I live. He didn't argue after that. He just turned and stomped back to the site, muttering under his breath. I could see the fear in his eyes when he looked at the river. Not fear of me, but respect, a quiet acknowledgement that nature, and those who understand it, wield power that no HOA paper can match. One evening, I walked along the riverbank, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the newly constructed homes. Smoke from the barbecues of the homeowners drifted lazily over the water. Kids laughed and splashed in small ponds the HOA had built to mimic the river, completely oblivious to the real threat nearby. I checked the dam. Everything was in perfect working order. The old levers creaked but responded. The sluice gates held firm. I could almost hear the water whispering, "Soon, very soon." That night, I had an idea. I needed to make them comfortable, to let them believe nothing would happen. So I started helping in small ways. I would leave the gate partially open, fix minor leaks, and even offer advice to workers about erosion control. Every smile, every helpful gesture was a lie, a trap. They were lulled into complacency, and yet they had no idea that I was recording everything. Not for social media, not for proof, but for the memory of the day justice flowed through their streets. I documented the encroachment, the violations, and every arrogant smirk on their faces. Someday, they'd wish they had paid attention to those warnings. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread in the HOA meetings about the riverman who owned land but never intervened. Some whispered that I was harmless, a recluse. Others, sensing the tension, claimed I was unstable. Both assumptions worked in my favor. Then came the first real test. A storm had passed overnight, leaving the river swollen. I drove past at dawn and saw the subtle panic in the crew as they realized the water was higher than expected. Foundations were damp. Trenches filled faster than planned. They scrambled to erect barriers, pumps whining like distressed animals. I smiled quietly from a distance. Just a taste. A preview of what the river and I could do. They thought it was just a storm, just bad luck. They had no idea that the real reckoning was still days away, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I returned to the dam that night, alone, under the light of a waning moon. I ran my hand over the main lever. The metal was cold, but in that coldness was power, potential, justice. I whispered to the river, almost like an old friend. "Are you ready?" It answered with a ripple, gentle but insistent. Soon, very soon, the HOA would learn a lesson they would never forget. And when it happened, the 35 homes on my land wouldn't just be wet. They'd be swimming in regret. The days dragged on, and the HOA crews seemed invincible. Or at least they thought they were. Every morning, the construction site buzzed with energy, machines roaring, hammers clanging, and Garrett barking orders like a drill sergeant. But I noticed cracks, not in their walls, but in their confidence. The river was patient, and I was patient too. One afternoon, I saw a group of workers nervously inspecting the bank of the river. A small leak had formed in one of their temporary drainage canals. They scrambled, sandbags in hand, trying to keep the water at bay. I drove past slowly, waving casually, my smile thin but knowing. I let them sweat a little, let them taste the uncertainty. They had ignored me for months. Now, the river demanded respect. That night, I returned to the dam. I sat in the small control room, surrounded by dust and the gentle hum of the sluice mechanisms. I traced my fingers along the levers, mentally rehearsing the sequence. This wasn't just revenge, it was art. Timing, precision, and patience were everything. One wrong move, and it could all backfire. I spent hours calculating flow rates, the potential reach of the water, and the points where their foundations were weakest. Every house had its vulnerabilities, every street its low points. By morning, I had a plan mapped in meticulous detail, a plan that would leave no doubt. The river and I were in control. Meanwhile, the HOA grew restless. Garrett came by again, his usual smugness replaced with thinly veiled suspicion. "You shouldn't be wandering around so much," he said, clipboard trembling slightly. "You're making people nervous." I leaned casually on the railing. Am I? Or are they just finally noticing that the river doesn't care about HOA approvals? He scowled, clearly unsure how to respond. For the first time, I saw hesitation in him, fear, almost imperceptible, flickering behind his eyes. The following days were a delicate dance. I kept a low profile, observing their routines, noting their habits, and making small adjustments to the dam. A partially opened sluice here, a closed valve there. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the river slightly more impatient. Every inch mattered. Every drop counted. Then came the evening that changed everything. A neighbor, a man in his mid-40s with a manicured lawn and a brand-new truck, decided to confront me. He stormed to the edge of the river, shouting across the water, "You! Stay away from this property!" I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, calm and steady, and said, "This property is mine, every inch of it. And this river? It obeys me." He laughed nervously. "You're insane." Maybe I was, or maybe they were just naive. Either way, I let him stew in that moment. They needed to feel safe, to think I was harmless, to think that no consequences were coming. That illusion was crucial. The storm clouds began gathering a week later. I could feel the change in the air. The river responded to barometric pressure as well as I did. It swelled slightly, heavier than normal. And that's when I knew the timing was right. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and the 35 homes that had invaded my sanctuary were about to meet the consequences of arrogance. I checked the dam one last time before nightfall. Every lever, every valve, every mechanism was ready. I could feel the river thrumming beneath me like a living thing, a co-conspirator in what was about to unfold. I whispered to it again, "Soon, very soon." From the distant construction site, I could hear faint laughter and the sound of music drifting across the water. They had no idea what was coming, no idea that a river could be patient and deadly at the same time, and when it happened, the 35 homes they built on my land wouldn't just be drenched. They'd be a testament to what happens when people think they can steal what isn't theirs. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, a small trickle of water creeping across the low-lying street near the far end of the new homes. At first, it was easy to dismiss, just a puddle, a leftover from recent rain. But to me, it was a message, a whisper from the river. The time is near. I watched from the tree line, concealed by shadows, as a worker noticed the damp patch and cursed under his breath. Sandbags were hurriedly dragged into place, pumps wheezing to life. They were panicked, but it was mild, barely scratching the surface of what was coming. Garrett appeared, phone in hand, barking orders. "Everyone stay calm. It's just surface water." Surface water. They had no idea, and that's exactly how it should be. I leaned against the old control panel in the dam, tracing my fingers along the levers, feeling the hum of water ready to respond. Every valve, every gate, every sluice was under my command. One careful pull, and the river would surge, moving faster than any human could run, carving its path through their precious HOA-approved paradise. The next morning, the water had risen slightly more. Low-lying basements began to show damp floors. Their panic escalated. Homeowners were running around, sloshing through mud, checking for leaks, frantically trying to salvage what little control they had. Garrett came storming toward me. He was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck, his voice shaky, despite his usual bravado. "You! This is your fault! You've been manipulating the river, haven't you?" I didn't answer immediately. I let him stew, letting the truth sink in slowly. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost bored. "The river? I don't manipulate it. I just respect it." His eyes narrowed. He wanted to argue, to shout, but the rising water was already making his words irrelevant. Pumps were failing, drainage ditches overflowing, and mud creeping along their perfectly manicured streets. By mid-afternoon, the first homeowners began evacuating. Cars stalled in puddles. Driveways became rivers themselves, and the laughter and music that had filled the air just days ago were replaced with shouts, slamming doors, and panicked radio chatter. I stayed on the dam, silent, watching the controlled chaos unfold. The first taste of fear was intoxicating. Not cruelty, but satisfaction. Justice. One of the HOA board members, a man who had mocked me during meetings, tried to storm the dam. I stopped him with a simple gesture toward the river. "I wouldn't do that," I said. He hesitated. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that this was bigger than their paperwork, bigger than their rules. That moment of hesitation saved him from becoming part of the first real flood wave. By nightfall, 35 homes were in disarray. Streets were muddy rivers, basements partially submerged. They were finally beginning to understand that this wasn't an accident, wasn't a storm, wasn't bad luck. This was the land asserting itself, guided by someone who truly owned it. From the dam, I could hear the distant wailing of sirens, not for crime, but for water. It was the perfect sound, a mix of fear, chaos, and inevitable consequences. I leaned back against the control room wall, running my fingers over the old metal levers. This was only the beginning. The river had shown them mercy today. A warning. Tomorrow would be the reckoning they would never forget. The night was dark, heavy with the scent of rain and mud. I sat in the control room, my hands steady on the levers. The river below throbbed like a living heartbeat, impatient, eager, and ready. I had watched for weeks, waited for the perfect moment. And now, it was here. I pulled the first lever slowly, almost ceremoniously. A sluice gate groaned open, and the water began to pour downstream, gaining speed, carving a new path through their freshly built streets. The roar was immediate and terrifying, a sound that no sheet of wood or cement could contain. From the tree line, I could see them, Garrett and the workers scrambling, homeowners screaming, cars floating in muddy torrents. Panic set in like wildfire. Pumps were useless, sandbags nothing more than toys against the force of what was coming. 35 homes, meticulously built on my land, were suddenly at the mercy of nature, and me. I felt no anger as I watched it unfold. This wasn't about vengeance in the petty sense. It was a reckoning, a lesson in respect. These people had assumed ownership of what wasn't theirs. They had ignored the river, ignored the land, ignored me. Now they would understand. The water surged further, breaking through the temporary embankments. Streets became rushing channels, carrying debris and furniture downstream. Basements flooded instantly, walls cracked, and the once pristine lawns turned into mud-choked rivers. Garrett's voice cut through the chaos, shouting orders that were drowned by the roar of water. He ran, trying to save what he could, but the river had already claimed control. He glanced up toward the dam, his eyes wide, and for a moment I saw fear. Real, unfiltered fear. A family's car floated past, spinning in the current, and I could see the horror on their faces. They screamed for help, for someone to stop it, for someone to save them. But the river didn't answer. Not because it was cruel, but because it had rules. Rules they had ignored. I walked along the edge of the control room, calmly observing, my heart steady. The river surged, but it was contained where it needed to be. No one was in immediate danger if they had reacted quickly, but the lesson would be unforgettable. Houses were damaged, yards destroyed, and the illusion of HOA power was washed away in minutes. From my vantage point, I saw Garrett collapse to his knees, drenched and defeated. He shouted my name, pleading, bargaining, but it was too late. The river had spoken, and as dawn broke, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold, the aftermath was clear. 35 homes on my land, symbols of arrogance and entitlement, were now humbled by something far older, far stronger, than any HOA document or approval. I leaned against the railing, the water churning below. It was quiet now, almost serene. The river had done its work. and it was time for me to step back and watch the consequences settle in. The HOA would be forced to face reality. Insurance claims, lawsuits, and public humiliation awaited them. But for me, there was no satisfaction in the destruction itself. Only the quiet, undeniable truth that sometimes the land speaks louder than words, and the river listens to those who respect it. I whispered to it once more, "Thank you." The flood had passed, but the story of 35 homes built where they shouldn't have been, would linger in the town's memory for years to come. The morning after the flood felt surreal. The sun rose over streets that were no longer neat suburban avenues, but muddy rivers dotted with debris. Trees had toppled, fences were washed away, and the 35 homes built on my land looked fragile, beaten, and very, very temporary. I drove past the site cautiously, keeping to the back roads. From a distance, I could see the chaos. Homeowners standing on porches, surveying the damage, horror written on every face. Cars abandoned in the mud, sodden furniture floating past like driftwood. Garrett was shouting orders, but even his voice sounded small against the power of what had happened. The HOA board had convened an emergency meeting in their hastily evacuated clubhouse. I didn't attend. No need. I had no desire to watch their pitiful squabbling firsthand. But I did keep an ear on the rumors, quietly collecting the juicy details. Insurance adjusters were on site, taking photographs, shaking their heads. Contractors were already talking about the cost of repairs. Everyone was pointing fingers, but only I knew the full story. No one could claim acts of nature, because the river had followed the path I had prepared. Every sluice, every diverted flow, every strategic breach had been calculated. Garrett approached me later that week, soaked to the bone, and still furious. "You think this is over? You'll pay for this." I smiled calmly. Pay for what? Respecting the land? Watching the river do its job? His jaw tightened. "You could be sued. The HOA will—" "They already have," I interrupted. "They tried to steal my land. They built 35 homes illegally. And now they're learning what happens when you ignore nature. And me." Word spread fast. Local news caught wind of the flood, interviewing homeowners. The story was sensational. 35 new homes, partially flooded, rivers bursting through streets, a mysterious river owner behind it all. Everyone whispered about the reclusive man who had lived nearby for years and suddenly reminded the town who really owned the land. I stayed back, watching. The chaos had consequences far beyond mud and water. The HOA was humiliated, public opinion against them, their authority questioned. Lawsuits flew back and forth like arrows. Some homeowners tried to blame me, some blamed Garrett. But the truth was undeniable. The flood wasn't a random accident. It was a response, a reckoning, a reminder of ownership and respect. Meanwhile, I walked the property, inspecting the dam, checking the river, making minor adjustments here and there. Nothing major. This was about teaching lessons, not destroying everything. My land was still mine, intact, safe, and powerful. Neighbors who once sneered at me now kept their distance, unsure how to act around the man who had unleashed the river. Some sent notes of apology. Some avoided eye contact. And Garrett? He spent the week fumbling through insurance claims, legal threats, and endless meetings with lawyers who couldn't quite quantify the river's obedience. I leaned back on the dam railing one evening, watching the water settle into its usual rhythm. 35 homes, 35 lessons learned, and a town that would never forget that nature, and those who understand it cannot be bullied by HOA rules, paperwork, or arrogance. For the first time in weeks, I smiled and felt a calm settle over the property. The river was quiet again, obedient, patient. And I knew, deep down, that if anyone ever tried to cross this land again, the lessons would be even more memorable. The town was buzzing like a hornet's nest. By morning, the story of the flood had spread beyond our little community. Local news vans arrived, cameras rolling, reporters asking questions that the HOA and homeowners couldn't answer without looking foolish. They said it was legal, one homeowner wailed, standing on her muddy porch. We had approvals. How could this happen? Approvals. The irony was delicious. Every journalist, every camera, every microphone seemed to catch the faint tremor in their confidence. No one asked about me directly, yet, but everyone whispered about the riverman, the recluse, who had let 35 homes drown in shame without ever stepping onto their lawns. Garrett and the HOA board tried to spin the story. It was an unprecedented storm, they claimed. Though anyone with eyes could see the culprits weren't clouds, they were calculated sluice gates and strategic river management. But spinning the story only made them look more incompetent. Every soundbite was a nail in their collective coffin. Meanwhile, I watched quietly from a distance. I didn't need to appear. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth was already speaking louder than any PR team ever could. People were beginning to connect the dots. The river wasn't random. The land was mine. And the homeowners, well, they had been arrogant. Legal threats started rolling in. Lawyers scribbled letters, demanding damages, threatening lawsuits. They wanted compensation for flooded basements, ruined furniture, and destroyed landscaping. But the deeper anyone dug, the more they realized they had built illegally. Their legal approvals were meaningless on land they didn't own. Every case they tried to make was undermined by one simple fact. The land had an owner, and he respected the rules that mattered. The local papers ran editorials. Some praised me as a man defending his property. Some labeled me a vigilante, but even in the criticism, there was a grudging respect. I had done what 35 arrogant homeowners couldn't even imagine. Enforce boundaries without ever picking up a weapon, without ever threatening violence. The river had done the work. I visited the property occasionally, surveying the damage in a detached, almost clinical way. The land was scarred, yes, but alive, resilient, and stronger than ever. I made minor repairs to the dam, ensuring the river would obey me if it was ever needed again. And every so often, I would drive past the neighborhoods, watching as homeowners tried desperately to patch their lives, their pride, and their mistakes. Garrett appeared one last time, trying to salvage something of his dignity. "This isn't over," he said, eyes flicking nervously toward the river. "We'll fight it." "You'll pay for this," I smiled calmly. "You already paid. 35 lessons, 1 flood, and a lifetime of caution. Some lessons don't need money to teach them. They just need consequences." As the weeks went by, homeowners left. Insurance settlements dragged on, and the HOA was forced to rebuild its credibility from scratch. But the whispers persisted. The river, the land, and the man who controlled both had sent a message that could never be erased. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set over my property and the river flowed gently, I felt a profound satisfaction. This wasn't about destruction, revenge, or malice. It was about respect, about boundaries, about reminding everyone that some things, like land, like nature, and like patience, cannot be ignored. From that point on, every glance at the river reminded the town, the HOA, and every greedy neighbor that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flows quietly, waiting, observing, and striking only when the moment is perfect. Weeks turned into months, and the town was still talking about the flood. 35 homes had been partially damaged, and some homeowners simply abandoned the properties, unable or unwilling to deal with the aftermath. Insurance payouts were slow, lawsuits dragged on, and Garrett's once proud reputation within the HOA crumbled under scrutiny. I continued to walk the property, observing quietly. The river had returned to its calm, obedient rhythm, flowing gently under the morning sun. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The land remembered. The town remembered. And I had reminded everyone that respect for boundaries was not optional. Word spread through the HOA like wildfire. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Angry homeowners demanded accountability from their leaders, while legal teams combed through every paper trail, every approval, trying to pin blame. Garrett and his team were left humiliated, forced to answer questions they had no answers for. Neighbors began avoiding the edges of my property. The once bustling roads that bordered the river were quieter now, the laughter and careless chatter replaced by whispers and cautious glances. People didn't know if I was watching, if I was waiting, or if the river itself might act again. That uncertainty gave me an advantage far greater than any confrontation could. Some homeowners tried to rebuild, but every attempt felt fragile, like forcing a puzzle piece into the wrong shape. Flooded basements, eroded landscaping, and damaged roads reminded them daily of their miscalculation. They had trespassed, arrogantly believing paper approvals were stronger than nature. Or than me. They learned, slowly and painfully, that some lessons can't be unlearned. The media occasionally revisited the story, labeling it The Riverman versus the HOA. Each article, each segment reinforced the narrative. I wasn't reckless or cruel. I was a guardian, someone who knew the value of land, patience, and timing. The flood had been dramatic, yes, but it was precise, calculated, and controlled. I had given them a warning first, a chance to correct themselves. They ignored it. I made minor repairs to the dam, ensuring it remained ready for any future tests of respect. Not out of vengeance, but for security. 35 homes on my land had taught me that boundaries are fragile if not enforced, and that patience without preparedness is wasted. In quiet moments, I would walk along the riverbank, the water reflecting the golden light of sunset, and think about the lessons learned, not just for the HOA, but for anyone who might one day challenge the land. The town had changed too. The arrogance and entitlement that had allowed 35 homes to be built on stolen ground had been tempered by humility and caution. Garrett disappeared from public life soon after, avoiding interviews, avoiding meetings, and avoiding me. The homeowners who stayed were careful, polite, almost fearful. The whispers persisted. The river, the land, the man who understood both. And I remained, quietly dominant, patient, a silent observer whose land had spoken louder than any lawsuit or argument ever could. The flood was over, but the lesson, eternal. Months had passed since the flood, but the memory of it lingered like an unshakable shadow over the town. 35 homes had been tested, 35 lessons delivered, and the HOA's arrogance had been permanently tempered. The streets were slowly repaired, some houses rebuilt, but the scars remained, a constant reminder that nature, patience, and respect cannot be ignored. I walked along my land one crisp morning, the river flowing silently beside me. It was calm, obedient, almost meditative, yet I knew it remembered every calculation, every carefully timed release. It was ready if needed again, and I, its keeper, was ready too. Word spread that Garrett had resigned, retreating from public life. The HOA board struggled to regain credibility, holding meeting after meeting, attempting to restore their image. But the town's memory was long, and their arrogance had been washed away in mud and water. Some homeowners reached out, humbled and cautious. Apologies trickled in, letters, emails, even awkward visits. I accepted some, ignored others. The lesson had been delivered, and the rest was their responsibility. One afternoon, I stood on the dam, watching the river ripple in the sunlight. A reporter from a national outlet had reached out, wanting a story, an interview, a photograph. I declined politely, knowing that the story had already been told. The water itself had made the statement. Media coverage would fade, lawsuits would settle, but the lesson, the river, the land, and my watchful presence would remain. A final twist remained, subtle but meaningful. A few homes, stubborn or careless, had been rebuilt too close to the riverbank. I made small adjustments to the dam, enough to remind them of their boundaries without causing harm, just enough to let them know that the land had a voice, and it was patient, but not without consequence. The town slowly accepted the reality. This was my land. These were my rules. And the river listened. The HOA would never again treat the property as theirs, and I, the quiet guardian, had ensured that respect would endure long after the floodwaters had receded. As the sun set, casting gold across the rippling surface, I whispered to the river one last time, "We've done well. They will remember." And they did, not just for the destruction, not just for the chaos, but for the undeniable lesson. Respect the land, respect its boundaries, and never underestimate the quiet power of patience and observation. The 35 homes remained, some repaired, some abandoned, but the memory of that day, the river's verdict, was eternal. And I, the keeper of the land and its flowing justice, would never forget it either. The river flowed quietly, the land stood strong, and the story became legend, a cautionary tale whispered through the town for generations. The HOA had learned, the homeowners had learned, and the land had been respected. That was enough. The story was over. But the river always remembered. And that's a wrap. A huge thank you to everyone for watching. This channel is nothing without this amazing community. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them down in the comments below. As always, subscribe if you're new here. Until next time, take care.